Mr. Commissioner, for the record, because Mr. Harvey began referring to some transcript references, Commission Counsel had provided Mr. Riddle with some of the transcript in the same context that surrounded the quote that Mr. Harvey put to him.
Thank you. All right, Dr. Riddle, I certainly give you time to comment, but I would like to go as quickly as I can. Mr. Eijvik and I have agreed that I'll leave him what I can, but he'll permit me to eat into his time, as it were. We've had Dr. Peterman's evidence. We've also had evidence of Jeremy Hume describing the impacts on the food web of a large number of fry in the freshwater system. And I expect you're probably familiar with that. What I would like to ask, unless you have anything else to comment, Dr. Riddle, on that, I'd like to ask Mr. Young if you agree, Mr. Young, that conservation of sockeye must necessarily include conservation of the food web and the other elements in the ecosystem that sockeye rely on.
Yes, I'd agree with that. If possible, I wouldn't mind commenting on the topic at hand as well.
All right.
Yeah, just to say that just with respect to the overspawning discussion, that my best interpretation of the information so far is that there are identifications of density-dependent issues with some Fraser sockeye CUs. I don't know that it's clearly applied in the same way across all CUs. I think it's also been fairly well demonstrated that high escapement levels that do lead to density dependence don't actually put that CU at risk itself of a conservation issue or of extinction. But that I do fully support the idea of actually reaching a point where we're working to maintain all of our CUs at a target reference point level, and that I look forward to getting to that place. Just want to also say that exploiting CUs that are at their target reference point or higher is something that I think is useful to work towards as much as we can. Selectivity of our fisheries is one of the opportunities to do so. I also want to say one other thing, especially within the context of ecosystems and benefits to ecosystems. Although yes, there can be some density-dependent effects at high escapement levels, potentially for some CUs, there's also some ecosystem benefits to those high levels of abundance as well. That's a strong nutrient input. It also provides some adaptive and selection opportunities for the sockeye themselves.
Mr. Young, do you accept that there are any benefits at all to cropping sockeye? Any benefits to the population?
Well, firstly, I'm going to have to accept the term cropping. I'm not sure exactly how I want to interpret that, but I would say that purely for looking at the short-term productivity of a CU, clearly there are places for at least some CUs where a high level of return reduces the number of spawners recruits per spawner. I think then you could say that there may be some benefits in terms of maintaining stocks near target reference point in terms of producing the most number of fish available to the fishery from that CU. In terms of the benefits to the actual CU, I'm not sure that I've really seen any evidence that there's a specific ecosystem or CU benefit in a conservation sense, in a sense of maintaining that CU going forward.
All right. Dr. Riddell, I'd like to ask you finally about the wild salmon policy itself, and this will assist us, I think, in moving into the next panel. Exhibit 8 is the wild salmon policy, and with respect to, and I just wanted to say, I went looking through it to see as best I could how the upper benchmarks are meant to be determined and applied. There's a reference on page 18. This is in the course of strategy 1, And I'd like you to explain, if we could bring it up, it's the upper right-hand quadrant of this. If it could be, that's it. As with the lower benchmark, the upper benchmark will also be determined on a case-by-case basis, depending on the species and types of information available, and may apply. The first bullet point is a proportion of the number of spawners estimated necessary to provide maximum sustainable yield on average annual basis given existing environmental conditions. Can you explain that for us?
Yeah, that example came from some work that had actually been done in Alaska, and you referred to a type of that analysis in previous testimonies, and that as a target, you don't necessarily have to fix the target at the number of spawners that would give you as a maximum sustained yield. And that, for example, if you did that, you'd say, well, we want to achieve 100% of the SMSY. Alaska has a target acknowledging that there's uncertainty in the data, and their target is, I believe, down to 80% of the SMSY. Okay. And so all they're really acknowledging is that with the uncertainty of the quality of the data that we deal with, that if you got 80% of MSY or you got 100% of MSY, you probably couldn't tell the difference in subsequent production of the progeny.
Yeah. With respect to Alaska, is that for the purpose of setting their upper reference limit?
They only speak about a target reference. They have, well, some people argue that it's not in their constitution, but the state biologists for fisheries have a requirement to basically achieve 80% of their SMSY. Right. Below that, they actually try to shut down the fishing.
All right. Is there anything equivalent here in the sense of giving guidance to the fishery managers as to whether they should be operating on 80% MSY or 100% MSY or 75% or whatever?
There's nothing in the policy now because that's part of the, as I described a little bit before break, that's part of the management target discussion that should go on in the preparation of the annual fishing plans. I mean, right now, implicitly, it's 100% of SMSY. But that doesn't have to be the case once you have a fuller discussion on, as you started out, the biological, the social, and the economic discussions.
When you say as it stands now it should be 100%, is that the upper benchmark you're talking about?
Yes, it is.
But it doesn't say that anywhere in the wild salmon policy.
It's not in the policy. In the absence of actually defining the upper benchmark, if you want, the default understanding now in management would be that your management target is, as it has been in the past, the maximum sustained yield spawners for sockeye.
Yes.
All right, but that can change as you define the benchmarks that you just pointed out Susan Grant's recent paper, and that has a number of various benchmarks identified in it.
Yes. Well, let's, just for the purpose of argument, take 1.7 million for the Shuswap capacity that's mentioned in the Grant paper. Is that what you mean by MSY?
Well, we'd have to be careful to compare it. If you're looking at habitat capacity, that's frequently a maximum production.
Yes.
Right? If you have very good conditions, you can find years where you get higher than that. But the expected maximum value would be the 1.7 million spawners would fill the habitat. Right? If the analysis that is most commonly done really is the stock recruitment analysis using the Ricker curves, and they may or may not actually determine the exact same values. All right? So it depends on what you're really basing the upper benchmark on.
Because you can sustain a maximum yield at less than the carrying capacity determined by Sue Grant and others, can you not?
You probably could be within the biological limits of how many fry can be produced. Yes, you could fill a habitat with less numbers of fish than required for the SMSY.
Yes, thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I have 10 minutes remaining for Mr. Isaac.
Good morning, gentlemen. Good morning, Mr. Commissioner. Philip Isaac for the Erie Gillnetters and the BC Fisheries Coalition. Funding for WSP is an interesting one. About how many salmon streams are there in the Fraser watershed? If you had to guess a number, more than 100? More than 1,000?
Sockeye streams,
No, I'm
200
just saying in general.
in general.
Yes, Coe, Sockeye, Pink,
I think you'd be getting upwards of 500.
upwards of 500. Do we have data on the escapement so you could set benchmarks for those streams?
Well, part of the policy is you don't need to. You need to for looking at distribution, but you don't need to have hard numbers in all. You do have numbers on almost all 257 Fraser Sockeye streams because they're very well known over a very long period of monitoring. But the conservation units need to have a way of evaluating the production from all of the streams within a conservation unit, and then it requires the department to define a way of evaluating the distribution between the streams.
That helps me a little bit. So let's look at the Stewart Takla. I think there's 37 streams,
87.
87 streams with spawners more than 100?
More than 100 spawners?
Yeah, per stream? Or are you just saying 87 streams within the
87 streams is the number of streams that I know in a number of our assessments for the Stewart Takla system for sockeye, and they will vary widely in the number of spawners, as you're saying. I don't honestly know if your number is correct, if you exclude below 100 or not.
Okay.
But it's in that
And
range.
you're confident that you've got good data on a year-to-year basis for those 87?
We used to have very good data on a wide number of those streams, and in recent years I understand that the number of streams being surveyed has dropped quite substantially. The primary spawning streams are being regularly monitored, and they are doing aerial surveys for the distribution amongst other streams.
And this is one of the things that our industry was kind of interested in, is 87 streams. What happens if a landslide comes out and wipes out one of the streams, and it wipes out all the stock in a year? Then the ice melts, and then you have the stream opens up again. But you've wiped out the stock on a one-year basis.
See, this is well,
How do you manage that CU?
that is not a CU. That is a stream. The CU concept is designed to address exactly what you've just described. So there are 2 CUs in the Stewart Takla system, I believe, for run timing differences.
Right.
And that within the CU, we can tell very, very little difference between many of the stocks genetically. And so the value of the CU is if you do have a landslide, because many of the areas are logged, right? So we do lose the return spawners in a particular stream. Once we get a freshet and we clean up that stream and you get lots of the dirt transferred to the lake, the populations in the streams around it will eventually allow recolonization of stream and to provide productive habitat again. That is one of the primary reasons for defining spatial units called conservation units.
So you manage by the conservation unit, not by the streams within the conservation unit?
Absolutely. That's the difference.
Now, right now we manage by 4 aggregate stocks, have I got that correct?
Well, not quite. People describe it that way. There are 4 run timing groups of multiple stocks.
Right.
And where the debate comes in is whether or not within any run timing group, all stocks within a run timing group are given equal attention. And that tends not to be the case. Of course, there are very large productive stocks. For the summertime Fraser Sockeye, for example, there are 2 or 3 very, very productive populations, but there are a variety of smaller ones that under the wild salmon policy you will have to also monitor to make sure that none of the CUs are being driven to extinction through management. That's really the bottom line. You can't.
And then perhaps it's a question for tomorrow, but if you could answer it quickly, I'd be interested. Given the difficulties we have managing to 4 aggregate stocks and some individual stocks with them, how are we going to manage for 39?
I'm sorry, what was that?
How would we manage for 39 CUs, given the difficulties we have sometimes with summer run interacting with late run, the early Stewart interacting with early summer, and so on? How do you manage for 39?
You're going to manage for 39 the exact same way you've been managing 4. Your assessment criteria is more spatially resolved now. You're not, as I just said, your bottom line requirement is that you can't directly manage the conservation unit to extinction. The reason that wording was chosen is analogous to your description before about a landslide. We can't look after catastrophic events. And so you really didn't want to strap yourself into a situation where if you lost something that you had no control over. But really what we're talking about now, and this is really part of the discussion you're talking about in the next few days, how do you make these decisions about how much you fish at what time during the season and what stocks are limiting the opportunities to fish within that run timing? And that will depend largely on absolute size of the fish within a conservation unit, and the driving factor really will be their productivity, because the sustainable rate of harvest in any fishery is driven by the productivity parameter in a conservation unit largely, until it gets very, very small. If it's very small, it just becomes at risk of loss by random events even.
Yeah. Well, we know that some streams you have highly productive streams, some are low, even within a CU. Pitt River, for example, has always been kind of a tough one because of the nature of the gravel and the freshet and everything else, compared to, say, Harrison or Cultus. How do you, that's again, you say, I'm going to treat this CU differently than that CU.
Yeah, and that's part of this full discussion, because we actually can measure, you have expectations of how productive a lake is going to be using some of the stuff that Mr. Harvey referred to. We do have a Fraser Lakes program that is expert in using these productivity models where you just assess the quality of the lake ecosystem. That can give you a value of productivity for that sockeye stock that you can start from. If a population is depressed and if the productivity is low, you may do things through habitat restoration, or you may do things through a temporary spawning facility to increase the number of fish.
What happens, and I know we have some of these problems, not so much in the Fraser, but elsewhere in stocks, where we have sea lions in the mouth of a river eating our coho stocks. Do we shoot the sea lions?
We have shot the sea lions. Well, not sea lions.
For fish farms we have, I think.
Yes, maybe. We haven't shot a lot of sea lions, I'm aware. We have shot seals. And that, these are part of the bigger ecosystem. I mean, I think now we're really talking about outside of our lakes. We definitely have seals in the lower river, and that has an impact on some of our assessment capacities, actually. And that, but when you're talking about seals as a major source of mortality on salmon, now we're talking about more of our marine ecosystems and other types of studies.
Now, I was interested in your comment that some people in DFO haven't bought into the WSP or have concerns about it. I wonder, where are those voices?
Well,
Because
I mean,
I don't see them reflected in the WSP or public discourse or this commission. Maybe you can help me on that one. Where are they?
Well, I think in terms of the departmental and public discourse, we're past that. We had achieved this national policy, and it is their requirement now to implement this policy. I wouldn't want to say now that we have people that are in disagreement or not implementing, but in the absence of what they see as additional resources to implement it under, if they perceive it to be a more difficult task, then they're certainly not making extra efforts to do that or something.
I have one quick last question, and it was about funding from NGOs and American foundations and some of the work. And you thought that on a short term it didn't matter. Some of the work they're doing right now is quite long term, though, isn't it? Advocating for PICNEMA, advocating for WSP and how it's implemented. Those are long term objectives.
Yeah, no, I wasn't answering for all
Okay.
sort of activities. I mean, I think that an appropriate use from my perspective is where we can use other sources of work to do these short-term. They can be verified by sort of typical public and academic peer review, so we can evaluate the outcome of the work and that. But I'm sure that they do have other agendas and other activities.
Yeah. And my last question, when a NGO sets up a process, they would pick who attends and who gets paid. They would pick the scientists that attend and who gets paid. They would pick what papers to publish. Isn't it better to have a independent science authority looking after salmon in British Columbia? Somebody that's not driven by an NGO? And I can see I'm getting...
Well, Mr. Commissioner, I was concerned about the way the question was framed, which included some hypotheses which he wasn't putting to the witness. He simply was asking him to accept that.
I'm sorry, Mr. Walsh. I know the point you were getting at because I was trying to shorten my question. If an NGO runs the process, they get to choose who comes and attends.
Well, ultimately, I suppose you're correct, but you know, if you're referring to my particular case with Pacific Salmon Foundation, it's a very wide involvement of people throughout the Skeena, because we know that if we eliminate any one group, that's not to our betterment in the long term. We are trying to have a totally open and transparent process as the policy requires. The objective that the people involved has set for the Skeena Watershed Initiative in this sense is to implement the wild salmon policy and to meet the obligations of the conditions of the MSC. And that, so we try to make sure that everybody that has a stake in this is involved, so we don't have any stumbling blocks down the road.
Do you report to the Minister of Fisheries through Parliament?
We do not, but
Okay.
any recommendation from, will go back to the department. And that, I mean, it's an advisory process as the wild salmon policy describes.
Thank you for your questions. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you.
Mr. Commissioner, Brenda Gertner, and with me Leah Pence for the First Nations Coalition. Just for your information, Commissioner, and for the benefit of the panel, my questions, which I believe I have 30 minutes to deliver or engage with you on, are going to be more strategic in nature. They're not going to be as specific as we've had. I've got a couple questions on specific, but as we've heard a lot of evidence of, and Dr. Davies spoke about, some of the challenges associated with fisheries management towards a sustainable fish, and perhaps sustainable fisheries is the challenge of managing people, not managing fish. And you're both nodding on that one. That's something you're very familiar with. I want to move to some of the challenges associated with getting people to work together and the different knowledge bases and all of those types of things. Talk about that with you, and then move into some specific questions around the implementation of the wild salmon policy. I'm going to start with Exhibit 224. Once that gets called up, you'll see that's a paper that was partly sponsored by the David Suzuki Foundation. And it's a paper on knowledge integration in salmon conservation and sustainability planning. You're familiar with that paper?
Yes, yes, I am.
And perhaps you could give the Commissioner a sense of why it was that the David Suzuki Foundation thought it was important to have a paper like that produced and made available to the public and to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans.
As I mentioned earlier, I think Strategy 4 is a key element of the policy and its implementation. I also think it was potentially the most challenging for one of the most challenging for the department to fully implement, and required the most input from other groups. We saw an opportunity to try to get some advice, bringing an expert on board to look at how best to potentially bring together different perspectives and stakeholders and interests around the issue of integrated planning as required under the wild salmon policy. Some of the outputs from this work really did identify how important it was to appropriately present information, for example, ensure that enough technical support was provided to participants and that information was communicated and presented in a way that people understood.
And you'll agree with me that that's an importance not only for Strategy 4, but in fact for all of the strategies, given the commitment under the wild salmon policy to integrate and address things like First Nations and the multiple sector interests, all of those things in the development of the benchmarks and the setting of conservation units. It was to be a collaborative effort all the way from the beginning, correct?
Yeah, I would agree with one just slight caveat, and that's that with strategies 1 through 3, there is a very strong technical biological basis to a lot of that work that could still integrate traditional knowledge and Aboriginal traditional knowledge, and should, and therefore requires that sort of communication and integration. But I just wanted to reiterate the point that a lot of the core elements of strategies 1 through 3 still really depend on having a strong understanding of the biology and the nature of the fish.
Dr. Riddell, is there anything you want to add at this point in time? I'm going to take Mr. Young through the paper a bit and then turn to you on a couple of matters, but just on any of this. Are you familiar with this paper?
Yes, I am.
All right.
I don't think I have anything to add right now, though.
All right. I want to take you to pages Roman numeral 6 through to 12 of the summary, which is ringtail pages 7 through to 13. And maybe I should just back up. This paper was written by Julie Gardner. Mr. Young, you're familiar with Julie Gardner?
Yes, I am.
And you're aware that some of her areas of specialization include marine conservation protected areas and policy and governance matters and land use planning issues and community-based stewardship?
Yes.
And she's also done a fair bit of work in public participation and collaborative processes, and that her work is used both by NGOs and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans to provide broader understandings and ideas as it relates to those matters.
I agree. That's why we commissioned her.
And Dr. Riddell, you're also very familiar with Ms. Gardner's work?
Yes, I am, and we've co-authored a few papers.
All right. I want to turn then to those pages that I've referenced. Now, she goes through these recommendations in quite a bit of detail in the report. I don't have time today to take you to them, and I would suggest that they're definitely useful for the considerations we have here. But let's start with the first one, recognizing different knowledge frames, and in particular, recognizing those without placing them in a hierarchy. Will you agree with me that one of the challenges going forward in some of the implementation of this is that there is a tendency for scientists to place their information in a slightly higher hierarchy than some of the local knowledge and the traditional ecological knowledge, and that we've got some work going forward to integrate that in a way in that we're not always placing hierarchies, but recognizing a complementary basis on which this knowledge can be used and put to work.
I would generally agree with that. I think that there's definitely some nuance to it. I think often it's not intentional. I think on the behalf of scientists, I do think there's a typical approach that DFO often takes to the way they present information that can be problematic for users, and that may be a part of the culture of that organization. So I think there's a layered component to that. I would also just like to acknowledge that a lot of the challenge may also be in terms of understanding when we're talking about what types of information we're talking about. So there's a whole, and I think this paper really goes into it in more detail, a whole number of layers that kind of make this up, but I do generally agree with your point.
And at the bottom of that same page, she makes the suggestion that not all knowledge sources need to be brought to bear in a multi-party process at every turn. And would you agree with me that's also a challenge in implementation? For example, many of my clients feel, because they've been left out in the process before, that they have to be involved at all of the processes, and that we've really got to get an education process going on to see how that knowledge can best be used at the right time, from your own experiences.
Yes, I would agree, and just generally to add that for this type of integrated planning to work, clearly all participants have to feel that they're meaningfully contributing and able to contribute.
And then if we were to jump over the next page, I'm just going to highlight certain areas, and then we're going to have to move from there. But the next comment she talks about, which I think is extremely useful in some of these processes, determining what information is needed. And she talks about collaborating early on what information is needed, and then clearly stating the problem and the objectives, and agreeing on the indicators, and agreeing on the research that would be required. You'll agree with me that that's something that she concluded?
I agree with you that that's something she concluded. I also personally think that that's actually the key, one of the key elements to all of this.
And Dr. Riddell, do you have any comments on this, as based on your Skeena experience and otherwise, how important it is to make sure that those people that are going to have to rely on the information are involved early in determining what information is going to be needed and what the problems are and how we're going to measure them and what research we're going to take?
Yeah, I would agree. I think one thing we're maybe missing in here too is that there's a time element, in the sense that the amount of effort, I think something that's holding up the Skeena watershed as a particular example is we tend to go up for particular meetings, but there isn't a regular interaction with some groups because some people really need more time to really understand what we're building on.
In particular, First Nations need more time often, don't they? They often need a lot more capacity and more time to figure out how that type of technical information is going to be influence their decisions and impact the exercise of their rights. Would you agree with that?
Yes, and I mean, I think that in fairness, sometimes we present issues that they don't agree with, and ultimately we're going to have to talk that through. And if we don't take the time to do that, I think the outcome is one now that we're finding that they're not participating. And that's a serious setback for us if we lose the participants.
And then the next topic she turns to is collecting and processing information. And there I found it interesting that she talks about throughout the process, the assembly and the use of information, but then she talked about considering participatory research and the need to make sure that, or the benefits of ensuring that more than one interest group or that more than one perspective is used right from the get-go in doing the research. Would you agree with me as being a useful approach to more streamlining the nature of the work that needs to go on in something as complex as the implementation of the wild salmon policy?
Yes, I would agree. I think it comes back to one thing I said about ensuring everyone feels that they're participating fully and that everyone's got an equal understanding of what the challenges, objectives, problems are. I think that's a way to do that. It also helps build the trust between the participants.
Dr. Riddell?
Well, I would agree with a caveat that there are different levels of involvement in research programs. Some of the very technical or very specialized equipment type of thing. We try to involve First Nations to the extent we can, but they tend to become, there's a long learning process in how to apply some of these things. But there are other activities where they're the lead programs, and habitat monitoring, habitat mapping, some of these groups are quite expert in this now. And that, so I agree, but there are different levels of involvement in many of the examples.
And would you also agree that time up front to understand that division of tasks and how they'll integrate and how there'll be an iterative process between them, so that different information is all equally used in the process, is also very useful from the get-go?
I think that your latter point's proven to be very important, that they are contributing to the information that is used and moving forward.
All right, she moves then on to her fourth recommendation, which is providing access to information in a transparent way and equity in the access to that information. Now, we've just, you'd agree with me that that's extremely important to make sure that the information is easily accessible as it comes in, that parties don't seem to hold on to that information until it serves a particular interest as to when that information is provided.
Yes, I would agree.
Dr. Riddell?
Well, I agree with the statement, but I, in all honesty, would have to point out that it's a two-way street in this case, that in the Skeena in particular, there are severe limitations we're encountering because we're not getting the information back from First Nation groups that had collected it. I'm sure that we're guilty of the opposite as well, but we find that this is something that there is a proprietary sense when people collect data, and we need to get by that in these larger watershed sort of processes.
I'm going to turn to that because of the complexities around traditional ecological knowledge in a second, and the author does a pretty good job of outlining some of those concerns, so let's get to that. Finally, she speaks about addressing uncertainties, and in particular, she notes that we can't expect uncertainties to be eliminated by models or otherwise, and that what we really need to be doing is working towards describing that uncertainty and sharing the risk assessment roles around that and making sure we understand the different perceptions on those risks. That's pretty straightforward as it comes in terms of moving forward. Is that correct? Both of your experiences, that's going to be necessary and useful in the implementation of the wild salmon policy.
Yes, I'd agree.
Yes.
Now, the next component I found to be useful particularly, which is improving communication across knowledge frames. And I want to take you to the body of the document on that. And in particular, let's start with page 24, which is where she begins to look at Aboriginal, local, and fishermen's knowledge. And she describes the nature of that knowledge, and then she goes on to describe the relevance of that knowledge. And then I want you to take a specific note of page 27, where she talks about limitations on the integration of that knowledge into this work and some of the challenges associated with that. And the first is that there's often concerns around the accuracy and verification, that from a scientific perspective, you like clear data that's observed in a particular way, you like, and you like a standardization and a scale, and that often when you move between that and traditional ecological knowledge, there's a fair bit of work that needs to go on to understand the traditional ecological knowledge. Do you guys do you appreciate that dynamic, and have you experienced that dynamic at the tables that you work at?
Yes, definitely.
Dr. Riddell?
Yes, although I'd say my experience is more limited than many of the people working directly in the areas.
And then she goes on to talk about the challenges associated with the proprietary nature of the traditional ecological knowledge and the concerns that First Nations have around injustices to the holders of that knowledge depending on how that's used. Dr. Riddell, you just talked a bit about your Skeena experience, about how there's a reluctance sometimes by First Nations to provide that information. Do you agree that that's partly in response to how it's going to be used, who's going to use it, how we're going to see that data used now, 20 years from now, 15 years from now, that there's a real trust issue that's going on that has to be worked out between the different holders of these different knowledge bases. Is that correct?
I don't think there's any question that there's a trust element. The particular example I was referring to probably doesn't even get this deep into it, though, because we weren't talking about Aboriginal traditional knowledges. We're talking about programs that have been funded by the Skeena Watershed Initiative, and that the information is not being processed and returned openly, so that the entire group working, all the parties in the Skeena Watershed Initiative, can benefit from the investment in the research, basically. And that, so it's a slightly different
All right.
example here.
Okay, I'm not going to, all right, then I want to take you to page 29, in particular at the bullets under the paragraph reading under appreciation of traditional local knowledge in relation to science frame and fisheries management acts, and there's a list there. Mr. Younger, from the work that you've done at various tables and in various places, do you agree that those are the types of concerns that are often raised at tables when we're integrating knowledge?
Yes, I think I have seen this. I'll kind of add the statement that Brian did as well, that although I have worked at different tables like this, I don't have extensive experience, but I do think that these are valid.
Could I just add, I think in all, this is probably true, but I think that people are moving past this. I think that there are examples where clearly the traditional knowledge comes from long experience living in particular areas and living with the various animals, and I think that people are seeing, as more of this comes out, I think there is a learning process on the side of the sort of Western science element, that there is some meaning behind these, and that they commonly do have good ecosystem type messages in them. And so there's a learning that goes on once this comes out as well. And so you will stimulate the trust going the other way as well.
But I want to perhaps point out at her last recommendation then is what she suggests is that you use structured approaches for applying that knowledge and be very clear on how those structured approaches are implemented. Would you agree that that is one of the ways in which we're improving the trust? We've actually, you develop the models and you develop how the decision-making processes are going to work. You see, people see how that knowledge is going to be applied. They understand that structure, and therefore they can, I'm going to say, trust the structure as distinct from trusting the people necessarily or the interests around the table to actually ensure that better decisions are going to be made at the end of the day.
Trying to think of how it's unfolding within my experience. I think what you say is true, but I think that if you're waiting to the last moment, you're probably minimizing the potential importance of getting that information out. Is the unfortunate
sorry, you would misunderstood my question then. It wouldn't be, you wouldn't wait to the last moment. You'd structure the approach from the beginning.
Oh, okay.
So you know how that knowledge and how that information will be used and how decisions will be made based on that, is what her suggestion is.
I don't think there's any question that's true, that we definitely have to have more both efficient and effective ways of getting this information available so we can benefit from it.
Now I want to go specifically to the wild salmon policy, and Dr. Davies talked about the challenges associated with getting past traditional behavior and moving into new ways of doing things. And Dr. Riddell, you were with the department for a very long time, and now you're working for an organization that, as I understood your evidence yesterday, is working very closely with local groups and trying to effect real change on the ground. And that's the difference between the department and local groups is an issue my clients have been challenged with for a long time. How do local groups and the work that happens in local ecosystems or in environments actually affect senior policy decision making that drives the implementation of something like the wild salmon policy? So I'd like to have your observations on what we can do to improve behaviors of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans as it relates to making local work more effective in policy decisions, in socioeconomic decisions, in all kinds of decisions that need to happen under the wild salmon policy.
Well, what you're describing is exactly why we wanted to include the Strategy 4. in all the time I was involved with the department, you always have the annual time constraint. You must make decisions to manage the fisheries. And frequently, you were making decisions in a field that you know was ripe with conflict. So when we were doing the policy and reestablishing that you've got to work from the diversity up, so basically you're working from the landscape up, we wanted to include the communities that have the sort of local knowledge and local understanding about what their long-term needs are going to be in particular areas. And you really build from the bottom up in that. And the Strategy 4 intention is to provide advice to the department that represents what people see in the regions about long-term aspirations for salmon in a particular area, what's the rate of logging. We were thinking really in a much more holistic environmental advice to the government. Now, DFO would have to deal with the salmon in that, and I think there was a great deal of concern about whether or not any of the department's ever going to take that advice to heart. And that, but what the wording was trying to present was a message that the department would listen to the advice coming from a consultative process on a regional basis, and that they would take that to heart within the bounds of, you can't limit the discretion of the minister, as they say.
All right, but I want to pick that up. I mean, you said that was the words, that's the policy, but you also just noted that there is discouragement, or at least an open question at the local level whether this is going to make any difference at all. And the commissioners just heard 2 days of the Cultus example, where that working group and the recovery team expressed very, very much exactly that problem.
Yeah.
All right, so we've got that problem. What do you recommend as a way of trying to ensure that the work that's done at the local level, even at the regional level, is going to make a difference when it comes to very difficult socioeconomic decisions that are going to need to be made as it relates to the implementation of this policy?
Well, that's sort of the heart of the question. My experience with the Pacific Fisheries Resource Conservation Council maybe is an interesting model. I very much think that some independent advisory council could aid the department in making these hard decisions. And that is the information that's been acquired, and is the advice coming through credible? Does it have strong technical basis? Does it have the community support? And I think we might actually look at it. There, in the past, has also been the Minister's Advisory Council for Fisheries, and that an independent council that maybe is like the Pacific Fisheries, the PFRCC, that could give advice back to the department, could go a long ways to strengthening the advice that goes forward to Ottawa. And if it had a stronger and broader consensus, then it probably has a stronger opportunity to succeed.
See, would you also need a commitment by government to actually take those recommendations to heart? And would you suggest that that be something that would either be statutorily or policy made firm by some either policy or statutory commitment to such an independent body?
Well, I don't think I could go as far as to say statutory, in the sense that we definitely ran up against the issue of fettering the discretion of government and that, but I don't think there's any question that there should be some obligation to consult on this and to take that advice to heart. If you don't do that, I don't think you can make these independent councils work very long. They will have to grapple with very difficult decisions. And if they're going to put that time and effort in, then there should be due consideration of that advice.
And would you agree with me that given where we are with the implementation of the wild salmon policy, that we're also going to need a commitment from government that they're actually serious about implementing this, and that they need to start showing that commitment on the ground by doing things?
Well, I don't think there's any question government's committed to doing it. I think that, as I said yesterday, a stronger commitment to really bring this to fruition over the next couple of years, I think, is really due. And that I'm quite concerned if we continue to go along without making progress and actually showing benefits to some of the discussions like we had this morning, that people will lose interest and they will not believe that the policy has any strength. So I think there really is an issue that we have to do. And there are benefits from doing it. I find this very hard to understand, talking to various groups, that the fishing industry in particular here has worked quite hard to get the sockeye certification. There are a strong set of conditions. We now are discussing the pink certifications, and much of it relies on implementing the wild salmon policy and better monitoring of the condition of the salmon resource. So those are very strong benefits that we could get by succeeding in implementing this policy.
And you'll agree with me that it will be critical to have a strong and clear voice from Aboriginal people on such an independent group. That without such, we won't be able to actually implement this in a meaningful way.
Yes, I don't think there's any question the way the treaties are evolving through time, maybe not as quickly as desired, but there's no question that in the future you'll have to have full representation through the First Nations in some way.
We won't have to wait till treaty. We need that now. Is that correct?
Well, hopefully, yes.
Mr. Young, I didn't mean to keep you out of this conversation. I know I'm going to have a little bit more time with you in the next panel. Is there anything you'd like to specifically respond to at this point in time?
I generally agree with what's been said. I just wanted to emphasize two key elements. One is that, the commitment and the implementation of the policy is one of the key elements I think we'd need to pursue to get this done. And yes, Strategy 4 is one of the ways we viewed linking the local and independent components with upper levels within DFO, and that needs to be done. In terms of the responsibilities or empowering of independent groups, whether it's scientists within the department or whether it's an independent integrated planning body, at minimum, what we need is greater transparency of what recommendations and information they're providing to the department. So using the cultist example from the last couple of days, one element that I think would have at least improved that situation more was the opportunity for that cultist recovery team to make their recommendations known in public, and that therefore the government would have to be much more clear about why they're making the decision they are and how it is counter to the recommendations of that team.
If you take that example right there, it would be extremely useful if there was also a significant strategic oversight committee that was aware of those recommendations and had a direct line to people in Ottawa who were responsible to listening to them.
Yes.
All right, I have very little time, and I have quite a bit of things that I still had hoped to cover with you. So I'm going to just ask some broad questions and see if I can get done in 5 minutes. I understand there's at least one question in redirect. One of the concerns that my clients often have, and I definitely get it as I'm sitting in this room, is that we talk about ecosystem-based management. It's a great phrase. And yet when I look at the wild salmon policy, what we're doing is that in order to implement it, we're dissecting everything again. We're dissecting conservation units, we're dissecting benchmarks. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that in terms of implementation. But what I want to ask you is, how are we going to take a multi-species ecosystem approach to wild salmon management? What are we going to do? Or what should we be looking at? I mean, I get Strategy 4, but that Strategy 4 isn't ecosystem-based management. I need to understand what your thoughts are on how we're really truly going to get to a holistic approach to multi-species management.
I can't answer the question fully, but I would say that it's my view, and I think it's implicit or actually explicit within the policy, that having the full range of information that the wild salmon policy is supposed to provide would take us a long way there. So having a clear identification of the conservation units, their benchmarks, their status relative to their benchmarks, an understanding of the habitat status around them for each of the species lined up and available for these integrated planning bodies to then go through and say, okay, we've got these CUs of concern, these habitat issues of concern. I think that's going to be a much better place to be able to identify objectives for these groups, for example, to come to a common understanding around what priorities might be. And with all of that information together, at least we're in a place where we've got a much more comprehensive set of information that we're working from that's at least closer to a broader kind of ecosystem perspective.
Can I just follow up with you, Mr. Young, on that? And don't forget your thought there, Dr. Riddell. I want to go there. Just on that habitat issue, on April 4th and 5th, the Commissioner heard a fair bit of information about the Environmental Process Modernization Plan. You're familiar with that, Mr. Young?
Yes, I am.
Do you have concerns with how that implementation of that plan is going to affect the ability to do habitat status reports and the collection of the information that's going to be necessary for habitat status reports?
Well, I guess connected in my understanding to the EPMP is potentially a reduction in habitat monitoring and staff, and so that would create that challenge. And I think it also potentially creates a challenge where there's ultimately less influence and control by DFO in a way that may ultimately limit the ability to use the habitat status information for the WSP to proactively influence or have effect on the environmental assessment and planning process as well as the enforcement side of the equation.
Thank you. Dr. Riddell, back to my earlier question around ecosystem management and the challenges of implementing a holistic approach when we're dissecting the system.
Well, the point I was going to make in Strategy 3 is I think you should think of ecosystem-based management as both sort of within the conservation units and part of Strategy 4. For example, we were talking about Quesnel Lake Sockeye recently in the cross-examination here, and there are ecosystem issues there in terms of effects on rainbow trout and kokanee and so on. There are provincial interests that had conflict with how many sockeye salmon were there. So that's an example where there is an ecosystem-based issue you want to look at within Quesnel Lake. But the example I would use on the other side is you need to have the sort of bigger picture look of the ecosystem issues. They're not all specific to a single CU, and I would go back to explaining the loss of sockeye in 2009. And the reason for that is a lot of that, we think, is likely occurring in the marine environment, right? So what is currently limiting production of salmon from the Fraser in the Strait of Georgia and in coastal ecosystems, right? There's extremely little work that has been done at the grassroots of the Strait of Georgia ecosystem. There's been nothing done essentially on forage fish other than herring. There's been nothing done on why the marine plants and algae have changed so much in the last 20 years. So there's an extraordinary amount of work that needs to be done in the bigger ecosystem issues, and that can then bolster how we can proceed to manage Fraser wild salmon down the future. Plus, there's the ecosystem issues of Hatchie-wild interactions.
All right, so just picking up one more thing on the role of habitat and how we're looking at habitat to improve ecosystem management. Dr. Riddell, yesterday you used the words different levels of monitoring and tiered monitoring approach or structure, and I didn't know what you meant, and I don't know if the commissioner knew what you meant, but I didn't know what you meant. I wonder if you could explain that.
In Strategy 1, in the wild salmon policy that you have up here, and I'm sorry, I don't know the page off by hand, there was a reference in there to levels of monitoring for salmon. We talk about indicator stocks, and then we have extensive indicators and intensive indicators. And the reason for this is that the indicator stocks are specific streams and species that are monitored very, very carefully. So fences to count fish in, tagging of juveniles out so you can measure marine survival. You can't afford to do that widely, but that's the indicator standard. That's the sort of top of the tier. Intensive sampling is a distributed number of streams with a regularized annual survey that's conducted as first priority of expense in that area. And you'd use that more for things like pink and chum salmon that are more widely distributed. Because there are many areas where there are hundreds of these streams, you can't do that intensive survey every year all the time. And so the extensive then is we would likely cover them by airplanes and helicopters, because what you're looking for is the distribution of fish through the habitat. You're looking for new blockages you didn't know about. You're looking for developments that are maybe impeding or losing estuary habitat that you're not aware of. Right? And so it's the levels of information you get, and if you have to cover huge areas, then you need to focus it down and really optimize the money you have to get the best data.
All right, thank you very much. I do have two more questions, Mr. Commissioner, if I may.
Commissioner and I have one question in re-examination, so run us a bit over the 12:30.
Would you agree, so my first of two questions is to specifically look at what type of recommendations might assist in implementing the wild salmon policy. And specifically, I wonder if Dr. Riddell, you could comment on whether it would be useful as a recommendation from this commission that we make strong efforts to move out of aggregate management at both the Pacific Salmon Treaty level, at the Fraser River Panel level, and at the IFMP level to assist in the implementation of the wild salmon policy.
Sorry to delay, but I'm not sure I understand that. You're saying to move away from aggregate
management. So we're looking at aggregates at the Fraser River Panel. We're still looking at aggregates as it relates to the IFMP. If we're actually trying to move fisheries, Matt, would you agree that as a recommendation we should be moving out of those aggregates and moving directly into conservation units management at that level?
We should be doing the assessments at the conservation unit, but it's not practical to avoid fishing on the aggregate. And that the fishing on the aggregate really is a matter of how hard you fish. And so if there is a mixed stock aggregate with a population that is going to limit access, then the fishery should barring these broader discussions about time of recovery and so on under Strategy 4. That's going to limit how hard you fish in the aggregate. But it's really not possible in the marine environment to avoid fishing on aggregates totally.
You're talking about, I want to follow up questions because do you have anything to add on that specific topic, Mr. Young?
I would say generally that yes, there is some need to move away from aggregate management. I think, though, that there is opportunities to manage at aggregates, but that the wild salmon policy really does require us firstly to review whether we're appropriately using aggregates, that the components CUs in an aggregate are adequately similar so that fishing pressure at the aggregate level can be said to be the same across those CUs, and that if we are fishing at an aggregate level or in a mixed stock area, that we're clearly fishing at a level that is adequately protecting the component CUs. So, for example, at exploitation rates low enough to support the recovery of a CU in the red zone.
I suppose, gentlemen, I'm going to need to ask this follow-up question, and I know that's going to annoy Mr. Wallace, but the issue that I have, or the question that I have is you're jumping to the outcome of the management decision, i.e. what fisheries are going to be opened or not. But before we get that, we need the collection of data, we need to understand the implications of decisions, we need to consider the risks associated with those decisions, we need to gather that information and have all of that information available to those that are making decisions. And if we're still doing that at the aggregate, they're not considering the implications at a conservation unit. You'd agree with me on that?
Well, I mean, they should not be doing that at the aggregate if that was the question. That dialogue is to be conducted at the conservation unit, and that is why you have to have the dialogue of Strategy 4, and you have to have the methods developed so you can look at the consequences of fishing on aggregates at different levels, because the component conservation units will respond differently to different fishing pressures.
And that's going to be necessary at the Fraser River panel level as well as at the IFMP level. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, the sequencing, of course, is that it's going to come through the IFMP within the constraints of the Pacific Salmon Treaty, and then it has to be, the opportunities within the IFMP are limited by how much you have to provide to the Americans. So they sort of go hand in hand. It's not one or the other.
Thank you. My last question is a question of clarification. Yesterday in your evidence, Dr. Riddell, you talked about $2.5 million per year for 2 years as a necessary first step in funding. Mr. Young, you talked about $3 million per year for 5 years, and yet in the paper that your council took you to today, you had $5 million for 5 years. 2 questions. Does any of these costs or suggestions for costs in any way consider the First Nation processes and the development of capacity that will be necessary to participate in this material? Or are you talking about DFO costs for DFO's work in these matters?
Well, I can only speak for myself, but I came up with that number because of talking to other people about substantially putting together a very concerted and short-term effort to implement the strategies 1, 2, 3, or at least aid the department in making substantial progress. And there would be involvement of First Nation peoples with that. I'm thinking very much more at kind of a technical level and that, but there are a number of people working with First Nations that provide the sort of feedback from, if you want, the Western science down to the sort of more local involvement and understanding. And that, so that could all be covered within it. But it would be a few people with the resources that you could get a really focused effort to get all this together so you can have these discussions that you talked about in terms of how do you manage the aggregates.
And Mr. Young, the difference between your recommendation of $5 million per year for 5 years to $3 million, could you explain that?
So I think the $3 million really was close to what Brian was just describing, ensuring that the core capacity within the department was there, that some of that money was also probably necessary to facilitate, for example, the creation of some of these integrated planning bodies, including potentially technical support of those bodies and some flow through for participation. The difference between 3 and 5 is likely kind of more of a recognition of all the other pieces that are going to be necessary. So, for example, the likely increased funding needed to support stock status and habitat monitoring, and potentially ultimately to support the full range of activities that would be necessary to participate in integrated planning, including by First Nations.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I don't think I can take any more time.
Mr. Commissioner, Ms. Gertner's last question was my re-examination question, so I have no further re-examination.
Thank you very much. We're adjourned then until 2 o'clock. I'm sorry, Mr. Wallace. And I'm also sorry to the reporter, I didn't have my microphone. I take it that concludes the evidence of Mr. Young and Dr. Riddell.
It does.
I want to thank them both, not only for the last day and a half of their testimony, but also for the fact that they were willing to come here more than just this occasion to provide this commission with the benefit of their knowledge and to answer the questions of council. Thank you very much.
You're not quite through with...
I think Mr. Young is coming back on another panel, but that I'll thank him after that's over, Mr. Young.
Hearing is now adjourned until 2 p.m.